Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this edition of ORF's Fellow Seminar. I'm Aparna Roy, Associate Fellow and Lead Climate Change and Energy at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at ORF. Today, we are featuring a very rich and insightful paper by our fellows Roshan Shah and Preeti Kapuria titled Finding Solutions to Water Scarcity, the Potential of Virtual Water Trade in Agricultural Products. This paper analyzes the patterns of virtual water trade in agricultural products across the globe and the corresponding implications for alleviating water scarcity. For those who are new to the concept, virtual water trade is the flow of water embedded in goods and services when they are traded. This paper will present to us today through its critical arguments that how virtual water trade remains a useful tool in water resource management. To review this paper today, we are delighted to have with us two distinguished experts, Professor Pranab Mukhopadhyay and Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. Allow me to introduce them to you all. Pranab Mukhopadhyay is a professor and program director of economics at Goa University. He's a fellow of South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics, Kathmandu, and was former president of Indian Society for Ecological Economics. He graduated from Presidency College, Calcutta, and did his master's and doctoral work at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has co-edited Promise, Trust and Evolution, Managing the Commons of South Asia, Nature, Economy and Society, and Global Change, Ecosystem Sustainability, which was published in Sage Publications in 2017. He co-authored the book Common Property Water Resources, Dependence and Institutions in India's Villages, which was published by Terry in 2008. Welcome, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Our second reviewer for today is Dr. Purnamita Dasgupta, who's a chair, professor, and head of Environmental and Resource Economics Unit at the Institute of Economic Growth, University of Delhi. Dr. Dasgupta has more than 25 years of research experience, and her research interests include environmental and natural resource economics, health economics, and development economics. She graduated from Presidency College, Calcutta, did her master's from Delhi School of Economics, and doctoral work at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Dasgupta has authored the book Climate Sensitive Adaptation in Health, Imperative for India in Developing Economy Context, which was published by Springer in 2016. Um, just to acquaint everybody who are joining us new with the format of the session, I will first invite our fellows to present their paper and then request our reviewers to share their comments on the paper. I would request all attendees or participants to type any question that you may have on the chat box, and I'll take them to the fellows on your behalf for a moderated Q&A discussion. I would now call the authors to present the paper, starting with Preeti Kapuria, and then followed by Roshan Shah. And you both together have 15 minutes to make the presentation on your paper. Over to you both.
Thank you, Aparna, and good morning to everyone. Since we got 15 minutes to go and both Roshan and I would be presenting, so I will be quick and then hand it over to Roshan to take us through the paper. So what I'm going to do is I'll try to give a brief overview of the virtual water debate, discuss certain aspects of virtual water trade that are relevant for this paper and form the basis of the paper as to why we wrote it. Now, I'll begin by what virtual water means, and then the water footprint. There is this argument in global water discussions that economies or regions that face acute water scarcity can and should meet their water demand for food through imports from countries that are better endowed with water resources and use their limited domestic water resources for higher valued activities. Now, sorry, just a second. Karan, can you put up the first slide, please? Yeah, okay, thank you. So there are certain regions like the Middle East and North Africa which are extremely water scarce and therefore dependent on other countries to meet their basic water needs, especially in agriculture. So these imports not only meet their domestic food demand, but also make up for the water scarcity in the region by utilizing water resources of other countries through the transfer of virtual water. Now, virtual water, as we know, refers to the quantum of water embedded in a product. And this term was coined by Tony Allen in 1990s, who chose to describe the term, who chose the term to describe the water used to produce crops which are traded in international markets. In that sense, along with the agricultural products that are sold and traded, the water that is used to produce them is also essentially traded. Now, since the 90s, several authors have estimated the flows of virtual water between individual countries and throughout the world by calculating how much water is used to produce crops in the major exporting countries. In fact, water footprint has been developed as a tool to measure virtual water over the entire supply chain from production to delivery to the consumer and including pollution produced in the process. Just to tell you, water footprint is the cumulative virtual water content of all goods and services consumed by one individual or by a nation or a business. And water footprint is typically divided into green, blue, and gray water. Blue refers to the consumption of surface and groundwater. Green relates to the consumption of rainwater, and gray is the amount of fresh water that will be required to assimilate the pollutant loads to meet certain quality standards. Now, however, let me just say there is often disagreement over the procedures adopted for water footprint calculations. So in our paper, we have shown virtual water imports and exports classified as green, blue, and gray. Now, if you look at the literature, much of the discussion of virtual water trade has focused on just national water endowments as the basis for decisions regarding the importing and exporting of agricultural commodities. Now, this does not imply that importing food is the only response the water scarce countries and regions should and can take. There are other measures concerning the supply and demand sides of water management, which are important: water conservation, rainwater harvesting, groundwater recharge, and so on. And then very important on the demand side is the pricing of water. Water is not generally priced in terms of its cost of depletion. Various subsidies hide the true cost of water, which causes market distorting behavior with negative environmental effects. In fact, crop price supports and subsidies may be well-intentioned, but they hide the true cost of water and encourage unsustainable agricultural practices. Now, going back to my earlier point of water endowments as the basis for decisions regarding trade of agricultural commodities, we know that agricultural production requires other factors along with water, like land and other inputs, that also vary among countries in terms of resource endowments, quality, and opportunity cost. In the literature, we find that trade patterns and virtual water calculations do not suggest that virtual water considerations alone determine trade patterns. Now, this leads us to the objectives of the paper as to why, what are the objectives of the current paper. Now, we try to analyze, the first is that we try to analyze whether water resource endowments are the primary factor in virtual water trade. Do the data support virtual water hypothesis, which I mentioned earlier, which states that water scarce regions or countries could alleviate water stress through importing water intensive products from regions or countries that are better endowed with water resources. In the paper, we test this hypothesis by mapping virtual water exports and imports against the per capita water availability in top virtual water exporting and importing countries. Although the observed trading patterns do not support this hypothesis, there is a lack of research to explore the reasons why trade patterns often do not support this hypothesis. We think in certain cases, differences in land productivity between agriculture and non-agriculture sectors could be the main forces determining the pattern of virtual water trade. What we largely know from literature, and I had mentioned earlier also, that there are several factors influencing agriculture inputs, input use and productivity: water price, labor availability, soil and land quality. Technology adoption is also vital to respond to water challenges. In fact, technology is key to precision agriculture. These are also the factors that can help determine opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Just to mention that, the virtual water addresses the water endowment of a country, but it does not address the technology of production or the opportunity cost of water and other limited resources. Now, while pricing and technology can be means to increase local water use efficiency and in guiding decisions relating to reallocation of water to its higher value alternative uses, virtual water trade between nations can be an instrument to increase global water use efficiency if we consider the opportunity cost of production within countries and evaluate comparative advantage. Similarly, water productivity is similarly, trade from nations where water productivity is relatively high to a nation where water productivity is low can lead to global water savings. However, trading, trading strategies based only on the notion of virtual water will not be helpful in mitigating scarcity or improving global water use efficiency. Now, this takes us to another very important objective of the paper, which is related to the first, whether virtual water trade can help in addressing the problem of water scarcity. What we find is that from the literature is that observed trading patterns are not consistent with those by the virtual water perspective. I've already mentioned that. Some countries that are better endowed with water resources import food, while some are water scarce regions export food. Now, this could be because the countries may have the advantage of high economic efficiency in food production, but resort to food imports, whereas some water scarce countries achieve high virtual water trade balances that could be at the cost of ecological sustainability. And this is where we find that factors like relative land endowments, access to arable land, water stored in soil profile could be very helpful than just water endowments in explaining the observed variation in international trade patterns. Political and not to mention political and economic considerations might also have greater influence than water scarcity in determining national trading strategies, export subsidies, import taxes. To give an example, from India, the Eastern India, which is India's wettest region and prone to annual floods, imports large quantities of virtual water not only from the north, west, and south, but also from the rest of the world. Now, such a perverse direction is the result of food and agricultural policies that have been biased in favor of states like Punjab and Haryana, which are relatively water scarce, where farmers receive highly subsidized agricultural inputs and are assured high prices for the wheat and rice they produce through the procurement policies of the FCI, the Food Corporation of India. So what's the conclusion that we're drawing from this? Now, there is no doubt that water scarcity is a critical issue that motivates governments to implement aggressive programs, but there are other broader set of goals and constraints that influence policy decisions like access to markets, rising demand for products, climate change, changes in energy prices that are likely to have greater impact on trade patterns than issues regarding water scarcity alone. But nevertheless, virtual water is useful as it globalizes perspectives on water scarcity, ecological sustainability, food production, and consumption. I think I'm going to stop here, and now I'll ask Roshan to take us sort of through the paper. Roshan?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kapoor, for the comprehensive introduction to our paper. Good morning, Chair, distinguished panelists and guests. Without much ado, let us look at some of the key observations from our analysis. Karan, can you please go to the next slide? Yeah. The two panels in this slide depict the relationship between net virtual water exports, imports, and the per capita water resources available in the country. The first graph represents the top 30 net virtual water importers. Most of these countries, especially the cluster in the bottom left-hand corner, are from the Middle East and North African regions. These countries have been experiencing historical water scarcity. The other major net virtual water importers are Japan, Italy, Germany, and Mexico. They too have very low per capita renewable freshwater resources. Thus, the decision to import virtual water has a strong relationship with the availability of water in the country. But when we look at the panel of net virtual water exporters and map that against their respective per capita renewable water availability, we observe that some countries like India, despite being some of the highest net virtual water exporting nations, have very low per capita water resource availability. The per capita availability of water in India, in fact, is lower than that of several major virtual water importing nations like Mexico, Japan, and Italy. This is a major finding in the paper, which has huge implications for water scarcity in India. Can you go to the next slide? So now, what does this pattern of exports have? What implication does this pattern of exports have for water scarcity? We take a look at the Falkenmark index to get an idea. Most of the virtual water exporting nations, except India, are above the Falkenmark threshold of 1700 cubic meters per capita per year. However, a declining trend in per capita water availability is visible among countries like Argentina, USA, and Thailand. As water scarce countries import virtual water to manage their demand for water intensive products, they add to the burden on the water resources of exporting nations. For example, between 1992 and 2014, the per capita water availability in India has declined by 30%. In Australia, it has declined by 25%, Indonesia 26%, and in Brazil, it has declined by 24% and 21% in Argentina. This has wider implications for global water scarcity because a few countries have become the major source of food products for the larger part of the world. This is further evident from the change in the total volume of exports from some of these major exporting countries. The next slide, please, Karan. As depicted in the table, the exports of cereals and oilseeds have increased significantly from India, Brazil, Australia, and Indonesia. The exports of oilseeds in 2014 from Australia, Brazil, and India have increased by 12 times their volume in 1992. The most significant increase has been observed in the exports of cereals from Brazil, owing to the extensive conversion of forest land for agriculture practices and increasing demand from China. In 2014, Brazil and USA accounted for around 45 to 53 million tons of oilseeds exports. In more recent times, Brazil has surpassed the United States as the largest exporter of oilseeds. However, USA has remained as a top exporter of cereals. It has been exporting between 80 to 100 million tons of cereals since 1992. At the same time, India has also experienced the largest increase in exports of cereals by almost 31 times. When it comes to the exports of meat products, USA and Brazil are once again the largest exporters. But in recent years, countries like India, Australia, and Thailand have also experienced significant increase in the volume of exports. The purpose of these figures is to show that the volume of exports of major water-intensive commodities like cereals, oilseeds, and meat from these exporting countries have increased substantially over time. When we superimpose this observation on the finding that per capita water availability is also declining at a rapid rate in these countries, it suggests that the time is ripe to incorporate measures that foster sustainable agricultural practices, especially in the context of water use in agriculture. Can you go to the next slide? We reiterate this point with the help of another index, the baseline water index, which was calculated by the World Resources Institute. As evident from the map, we can see that some of the major exporting countries that we have identified are also delineated in red, which suggests that they have extremely high water stress or range between medium to high water stress in terms of their indicator. The indicator is calculated as the ratio of total water withdrawals to total annual water supply. Now, if the current trend of increasing virtual exports through agriculture products continue, then it is only going to further increase the water stress in these countries. This pattern of virtual water trade may not help in ameliorating the problem of water scarcity as initially envisaged by Professor Tony Allen. However, we do not intend to discredit the idea of virtual water trade here. What it requires is a deeper understanding of the underlying drivers of such patterns, as Dr. Kapuria has already mentioned, and what can be done to ensure that it becomes an efficient tool in addressing the problem of scarcity, water scarcity. Can you skip to the next slide? Some of these factors have already been discussed by Dr. Kapuria, so I'll move on to the next one. Yeah, so now the purpose of our paper is to suggest that since these countries, some of the exporting countries have been experiencing water stress and it's likely to increase, the estimation of the cost of water used in agricultural production based on the scarcity value of water is a necessary intervention. It will help understand comparative advantage, which is a decisive factor in determining the patterns of trade, especially in products that are water intensive. There are markets for other factors of production like land, labor, and capital. And the cost of these factors of production play an important role in determining comparative advantage. However, water remains largely ignored in these cost estimations. And at times, government support for irrigation often subsidizes the use of water. This leads to the creation of a false perception regarding water scarcity. A few major subnational studies in the context of India and China have already shown that this leads to the perverse flow of virtual water trade. Looking forward, virtual water trade can also be an alternative to several interlinking river projects and help in avoiding some of the huge economic and ecological costs associated with the river linking projects. But as the paper highlights, that although virtual water trade in water-intensive agricultural products can be a tool in ameliorating water scarcity, it needs to incorporate the cost of water used in the production process, along with some of the other factors that have been identified, so that we can arrive at better outcomes. Under the current business as usual scenario, the problem of scarcity may not be addressed through virtual water trade alone. So to conclude, we observe that while there are several other factors determining agricultural trade, and therefore virtual water trade patterns, the cost of water is an important factor which needs to be taken into account. The scarcity value of water needs to be incorporated in evaluating the competitive advantage in water-intensive agricultural products. Only then can the policy relevance of virtual water trade be enhanced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preeti and Roshan, for a great presentation. I would now like to invite Professor Pranam Mukhopadhyay to give his feedbacks or comments on the paper.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this very timely paper by Preeti and Dr. Shah. And I'm familiar with a bit of this work because Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh had earlier talked about it. So the framework is something that I know, but I myself haven't worked on. And I have a small set of slides. I don't know if I can be permitted to show them. I guess if I can, which I probably will. Yeah. Okay. So just a quick set of slides. This paper is an extremely timely paper. It is worth talking about in the context where India's water, stress situation is getting worse, as the paper has highlighted. And the framework that is being offered for managing this is the virtual water trade framework. And the question that needs to be asked is, has this framework helped? And the answer is probably no, which is why we are here discussing about it. And the solution is to make it, use the market framework to find a way to relieve this scarcity in areas where there is water stress. So what is the framework that is being used by the authors? The framework that has been proposed is the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And just for our recollection, what are the assumptions of the Heckscher-Ohlin model? That whenever two countries trade, both countries have identical production technology, but the technologies used for the two commodities differ. And here we need to remember that this is talking about a 2x2x2 model where there are two countries that trade, there are two factors of production, and there are two commodities. So one is typically the agricultural commodity and the other is the industrial product. The model also assumes for convenience a constant returns to scale and a diminishing returns to factors. And while there is factor mobility within the countries, there is no mobility between countries of the factors of production. And a very crucial assumption that this model makes is a full employment, especially of labor, apart from all the other factors of production. Now, the Heckscher-Ohlin model has its problems, but it is the 101 in international trade when you go into discussion. And what are the main takeaways from, this model? The main takeaways are that there is a factor price equalization, which will occur over a period of time as goods are traded. The prices will converge as well as factor prices will converge, which essentially meant to suggest that there was no need for trade in factors as long as there was a free market for traded goods. And eventually a country that is capital abundant will export capital intensive goods, and a country that is labor abundant will export labor abundant goods. The problem is that this wasn't what occurred over the period of our history over the last 60 years or so. And the most talked about paradox was the Leontya Paradox, who found that the United States, which was a capital abundant country, was actually exporting labor intensive goods and importing capital intensive goods. So the framework itself has a challenge right there, and this is something that is relevant to this study. And one of the hypotheses that emerged from this discussion and the debate around the Hex-Sherling model was the Linder Hypothesis, which suggested that inter-country trade is actually driven by similarity in demand, by specialization in differentiated goods, even if nations are identical in preference and factor availability. So moving away from the supply-driven models of international trade to demand-driven models of international trade and preferences. So Dr. Shah and Dr. Kapuria's virtual water paradox actually falls very well into this Leontyev kind of a framework, which challenges the very basis of the predictions of the Hex-Sherling model. So that would be my first, comment here, in the sense that I think it would be, I know that they have put various caveats in the paper, but it would be nice for them to put it in a framework where they actually see their own outcomes, where they see water-stressed countries actually becoming exporters in virtual water, rather than the other way around as one would have expected in the Hex-Sherling model. What are the other concerns that I have? And I'll very quickly sum them up. One is that when we are comparing, most part of this study, which is slightly different from the presentation that we saw by the authors today, is being done at the inter-country level. Now, for large countries like India, which have multiple ecological zones, and the water availability actually differs not only across states and regions, but across different agricultural zones, there is a wide differential in output and productivity as well as water availability. So rather than look at national level water figures, it might be better to look at zones of production. And we know that there is a large concentration of production, especially the export part of it, in our country, and see what the kind of stresses are. And my suspicion is that you might get something different from looking at just country level studies. However, I can understand that when you're looking at the global map, it's difficult to do. But if it's among a selection of countries, especially when you're dealing with large countries, this might be a matter of concern you might want to address. The other is with regard to the scope of the study. And here, what I'm arguing and what my worry is that if we single out agriculture to talk about misallocation of water resources, then we are missing out on probably a larger picture. And we need to understand that water is conjunctively used in industry services as well as for domestic consumption. These are competing demands. And if we focus only on agriculture, then we might actually be sending the wrong signal for intersectoral allocation. So the distortion in the water market we know exists in every segment. Why single out agriculture? Why not look at it in a larger picture? And I'm sure that you all have, probably thought about it already. But I just think in the current context of our, larger policy debates, we should not send out the wrong signal on this front. The third concern I have is regarding the period of the study, and it was, as a reader, a little confusing for me when I saw different segments of the paper use different time periods. And I can understand that this is a policy paper and it's not driven by a single model that leads up to a conclusion on a certain individual maybe a econometric or a non-econometric model, but for a reader, it becomes a little difficult why different segments are using different time periods. So for the reader's convenience, it would be great if we could find a common, time frame. And in figure 4, I found that I think it's the World Bank data that's being used, and it stops at 2014. Whereas the same data is probably being used for figure 6, where it stops at 2018. So I was not sure why there is this gap in the data range that is being used. The third is with regard to the balance across sectors. And I understand this is a partial analysis, it's only looking at agriculture. But if you look at it from the perspective of India's trade strategy, and in the need for agriculture to support our imports on other fronts, especially low elasticity imports of oil, then the shadow price of water that we might be thinking of might be slightly different from a partial equilibrium analysis. And I would encourage the authors to think of it on a broader scale and ask what happens in terms of water pricing if we were thinking of it across different commodity products that India trades in, especially as far as exports imports are concerned, of low elasticity products which are necessary for our industrial and our domestic consumption. I think this is my last slide. I want to start by saying that it would be great if there was a little more explicit discussion on the stock flow issues on resource management. And what I mean by that is that agricultural production uses both stock of water as well as flows. I know that there is a reference in the paper on renewable internal freshwater resources, but it doesn't, link up the water stress that is building up in many of our agrarian zones with respect to declining water tables. And if we could somehow link your study to that more explicitly, that I think would have great policy implications. So that's my last slide, and I thank you very much for the opportunity. Back to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. That was a set of very comprehensive comments or feedback on the paper, and I'm very sure that our authors have gained significantly, from your overviews. We should have Dr. Purnamita Dasgupta to join us, but I would like to confirm because there was a little glitch from her end due to internet issues. And so there might be a little bit of delay, or we don't know whether she'll be able to join us. I'm extremely sorry for that. But I'd request the authors, I would first request the participants to, start putting their questions, if they have any, to the authors in the chat box so that I can take them on your behalf. And in the meantime, could I request Preeti or Roshan to respond to Dr. Mukhopadhyay's comments, please? If you would like, so that by that time I can take the questions that the participants might send to us.
Roshan?
Yes.
Okay. You can take up. Yeah. Let me just sort of first sort of mention the Pranab actually recommended sort of he gave us a lot of inputs right now. I mean, this could be, all of them could be like separate papers in themselves. So see, let me just mention that the objective of this paper right now was to understand where we stand, what is the debate as far as virtual water trade in agricultural commodities is concerned. So this study is not, it's like we had sort of, this is just a sort of maybe a first study, a first paper that we have written. But then as we move on, I mean, and this is not just as we move on, perhaps more work will come up, and we will look at some of the suggestions that have come up. We understand, yes, when he talks about the balance across trades, water pricing, we talk about intra country, yes, stock and flow discussions, yes. But right now, we just wanted to keep it as a sort of a conceptual paper. Initially, we had thought we look at virtual water trade in industrial sort of goods, but then the major problem was the literature is not much we couldn't find, and the data is another major problem that we sort of could not get access to, or we didn't know how to start. I mean, we had the issues with the data. So we thought that in the first phase, to begin with, let's sort of understand the current discussions, what the literature has to say on virtual water trade. And it so happened that agriculture is so important when it comes to virtual water trade that it popped up whenever we were trying to look for models, or we were trying to look for papers or empirical work done, that we can find it. We can find this our first paper to agricultural trade in agricultural commodities. But yes, there are. We have. This was just a very broad sort of an overview. Some of these, what he's suggesting, can be taken up, and we may, because water also happens to be a core area of research in or Kolkata. So we may take them up and do a micro study. So thanks. I mean, these are very useful comments, very useful suggestions, and we will look into them. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Roshan, is there any specific that you would want to respond? Yeah.
Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Mukhopadhyay for his comments. I mean, yes, they are very pertinent, and they, in fact, once we address those comments in subsequent papers, it will enrich our paper. But yes, as Dr. Preeti Kapoor has already mentioned, data was a problem, and I would just like to clarify with respect to figure 4 in the paper. Yes, the figures are till 2014 because they are the per capita water availability figures. Unfortunately, I could not get access to 2018 data from the World Bank. 2014 was the last that was available for all countries that we have used. So that was one reason why I stuck to 2014. But and yeah, that is one comment that I wanted to address. And otherwise, yes, agriculture has been singled out because, as Dr. Kapuri already mentioned, it is the largest primary consumer of water, and some of the maximum subsidies in water are given in that sector. So that was the initial reason why we chose agriculture sector as our topic of study. And the inter-country and intra-country differences are also very high, especially in a country like India with various ecological zones. And ideally, virtual water trade as a tool to address water scarcity should, in fact, be done in a manner that takes into account these ecological factors, and probably in an agroclimatic zone-wise model, something like that. But I mean, that I think would require intensive field research, and at this moment, we do not have access to data to even, I mean, do some sort of an estimate of that. So that was the reason we could not do those. And since it was a review study, we wanted to identify what was the overall situation across the world. And therefore, we have tried to get as uniform data as possible for all countries across the world, which was not possible all the time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Roshan and Preeti. There are a couple of questions that we would like to take. We have a senior hydrogeologist who has joined us, and he has presented a few questions. One is that given the progressive water scarcity, as we are witnessing during our lifetime, is it time that all products start labeling their water footprint too to provide us the real value of the product? His question number 2 is, do the current practices of water footprinting discriminate between the consumptive and conjunctive use of water? And the third one would be, do the current practice of water footprinting discriminate between the, oh, sorry, this is what I already read. Yeah. And the third one was, most of the water footprint information that we have are on generalized water consumption without giving cognizance to local sub-basinal water availability characteristics. Do you think the water footprint numbers would change if we take locational resources availability features into consideration? And would that be a more appropriate and deterministic process for various applications of water footprinting and virtual water trade? You could take the questions, Preeti and Roshan.
Yeah, I think coming to his first question where he says, can it be labeled? I think yes, we must. And as I had mentioned, that this is useful for creating sort of public awareness as to what we are consuming and what impact it has on the environment. So yes, labeling would be good if it can be done, because as I had mentioned that there are problems with the calculations. We did not get into it. We did not go further on the water footprint calculations or on the water footprint debate, but we picked up what was relevant for the paper. Yes, labeling would be good, would be ideal. Can I then come back to he also, Roshan?
Yes, please.
Can I come back to what was his second? I just sort of what was his?
Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah,
Preeti?
if you can.
Yeah, so his second question was, do the current practices of water footprinting discriminate between the consumptive and conjunctive use of water?
At the moment, I can't comment on, we since we did not venture much into the current practices, I cannot comment unless I am very sure what they are right now. So I think I'll not comment on this question until I know what the current practices are.
Okay, and if anybody of you would like to respond to his third interesting question, that most of the water footprint information that we have are on generalized water consumption without giving cognizance to locational or subbasinal water availability characteristics. Do you think the water footprint numbers would change if we take locational resource availability features into consideration? And would that be a more appropriate and deterministic process for various applications of water footprinting and virtual water trade?
I think I would like to take that question.
Sure, Roshan, go ahead.
Yes, definitely. I mean, since as Professor Mukhopadhyay has also mentioned that the vast differences in agroclimatic zones between countries will play a major role in, and when we analyze it at that level, obviously the water content or the water productivity of different regions will differ, and also with technology. So yes, if water footprint and virtual water trade is to take into account the sub-basin wise or a locational factors into account, then yes, they will definitely be a better way to address the problem of water scarcity, because they would be more closer to reality than doing it at a large scale, such as a country-wide scale. So yes, that would definitely be, but then that would require field research, adequate data points for that, which we have not reached that step yet, level yet. So yeah, yes, that's my response to it.
Sure. We have a comment from Ambassador Navdeep Suri, who is the director at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at ORF. Yeah, and his comment is that this is a very important paper, and it's important to look at declining groundwater level. In some parts of Punjab, it's now below 200 feet. Free electricity for tube wells play an important role in aggravating the situation. I think that's
that we agree with that. I mean, that's what I also presented, that yes, that is the reason. Subsidies, yes, they are the reason. Cropping patterns, yes, in Punjab are the reasons that yes, groundwater tables are declining. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Then we do not seem to have more comments and questions coming up as yet, and I think okay, there is another interesting comment from Ambassador Suri, and in fact a question. He said that in pricing of water, the authors have looked at the Australian model where water ownership is delinked from land ownership and water is a tradable instrument. I cannot read the full question. I think this is more of a comment or a question. If Preeti, you or Roshan would want to respond to that.
I would like to respond to that. Yeah.
Sure, Roshan.
We haven't explicitly looked into the model, but yes, we know that there is a model that exists in the Murray-Darling Basin, and there are also several other examples in Chile, in California, and several other parts of the world. And yes, it is one of the one of the practices that can be implemented. But in order to suggest something like that, I would have to look into the intricacies of the model, but which I haven't done so far. But we acknowledge the fact that yes, these models are there, and these are some of the best practices that we could emulate. Recently, the water futures market was launched in California. So that is also something that we could look forward to if that can be replicated in South Asia. In fact, Dr. Ghosh, our director, has an article on that where he suggests that water futures market in South Asia is a possible way to alleviate water scarcity in this region. So yes, pricing of water based on these models could be a possible way to help alleviate the problem here.
Sure. Thank you, Roshan, and thank you, Preeti. I do think that there aren't any more questions as yet. I will just I think there is Ambassador Suri had posted a question via team links, but I don't know if we are able to view that. I'd request him, if he has any more questions, he can post it at Q&A. Otherwise, we'll inch closer towards concluding this session. Yeah, okay. So it seems like we have taken all the questions that were with us and the interesting comments. I would now like to conclude the session, and I first would like to thank Preeti and Roshan for presenting to us this very interesting paper that was a comprehensive analysis, of a new concept. And I thank you very much to, take a deep dive on a study that hasn't been yet touched upon. As you said, that there are research gaps. I think a lot of stakeholder would significantly benefit from your research and evaluations and assessment, and also give a clear recommendation for what could be more interesting areas, subsets, or researches that could be carried forward in the same in the same subject. And thank you, Professor Mukhopadhyay, for your comprehensive reading of the paper and your reviews. And as I said, I'm pretty sure that the authors have gained significantly from your inputs and your expert comments. Thank you, all the participants, for joining today and contributing to this very enriching conversation through your comments, through posing questions to the authors. And I think that will also add significantly in helping the authors to, to mend the research gap and give them possible or potential ideas for writing more or contributing more to the subject and narrative. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at the next edition of our Fellows Seminar. Have a very good day. Thank you.